Welcome to Blitzscaling a Startup. I'm Julian Newman.
And I'm Chris Yeh.
And Chris, you have been traveling the globe. I have not moved, but my life has changed a lot. My wife left me.
What?
She went to Taiwan.
Well,
so
you've got to phrase that differently, Julian. As the saying goes, phrasing.
But yeah, so I'm now a bachelor for a few weeks. So it's the big event.
There you go. Now you can do all those bachelor things that you and I enjoy so much, whatever those are.
Yeah, like walking to the corner store, the 7-Eleven, buying ramen. Great stuff. How was you? You were in Abu Dhabi. I thought you were going to Tokyo too.
So I was in Dubai and Abu Dhabi last week. So I flew into Dubai, arrived on Monday night Dubai time, spent Tuesday in Abu Dhabi, and then Wednesday and Thursday in Dubai before flying back. So it was quite a whirlwind trip, but very, very useful, I think. And then I'm flying to Tokyo tomorrow. So I'm actually leaving for Tokyo tomorrow morning.
So if any of our listeners are in Tokyo and they're listening to this on March 2nd or 3rd, they can maybe hit you up on LinkedIn and see if you're around.
Yes, especially all of our listeners who are billionaires. I would be happy to hear from you.
Yeah, I'm sure you'd be happy to hear from them anytime.
That's true.
Even if they're not in Tokyo. Yeah, okay. I lied to you, Chris, because I sent you a topic and then I've changed my mind about that topic. So
that's fine. I didn't read the email anyway, so there's no time lost. All good.
Perfect. The topic I wanted to discuss is phone usage and, let's say like internet hygiene as an entrepreneur. And this, our listeners likely don't, that I don't have a phone. Actually, I now have 2 phones, which I use for development of this app. I gotta tell you, like, doing software development is very detrimental to my sleep schedule and my health. You might have noticed, like, my hair is super long. Like, I just don't take care of myself.
I did notice your hair was longer than normal. I'm like, that's interesting. I thought perhaps this was connected with your bachelor life.
No, it's just like I'm staying up till late and just like trying to figure out bugs. This week I managed to get notifications to work on my app, which is really fun. But it's a very unhealthy thing to do, but it's really fun. I really enjoy doing it. Yeah, anyway, so I do now have 2 phones, an iPhone and a Android that I use for software development. But other than that, I don't have a phone. And that's very unusual. Generally, it's unusual also for entrepreneurs. And I know it's not what you do. My belief is that it's actually increasingly important for entrepreneurs who need to perform at work to get this right. Like, you can become tremendously unproductive if you spend all your time on your phone in the wrong way. And you can become tremendously unproductive as an entrepreneur generally. Like, it's so easy to get pulled into the wrong things as an entrepreneur, and it's so easy to get pulled into the wrong things on your phone. So the kind of combination of those two is just this really powerful force for evil and unproductivity. So yeah, Chris, what's your initial reaction to how you think entrepreneurs should deal with their internet hygiene or phone hygiene?
So I think that the answer is to be more deliberate about it. I think that the complete avoidance approach that you have adopted is challenging, to say the least. I don't think it's going to work for most people. but I appreciate some of the reasons behind it. So I think that the best thing we can do is, again, as always, to unpack the issue and say, what are the negatives of using your phone in the wrong ways? What are the ways in which you should use your phone? And how do you arrange your life so that you are using your phone in the right way and not the wrong ways? So let's talk about the wrong ways to use your phone. There are several characteristics about your phone that make it different than the other devices in your life. The first, of course, is the form factor, which does two things. It makes it much more portable, and it also makes it a terrible, terrible thing to do work on. And I never cease to be amazed by the people who try to do all the work on their phone, presumably because they're very used to it. And I look at that and say, why on earth would you do that? That's like a chef saying, I will cook, but the only tool I will ever use is a blender, and I will use it for
What's
everything.
who this guy who's the CEO or was the CEO of Jet.com, Mark
Mark Lord.
Laurie or something? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. He
I don't know him
apparently,
personally, but yes.
yeah, well, me neither, but I know of him, and the only thing I know of him, other than that I used to see a lot of Jet.com ads in the metro in New York, is that he doesn't have a laptop. He doesn't have a computer. He only works off his phone.
Sheer insanity, but obviously he's not someone who has to do a lot of content creation.
Clearly.
So let's talk about what that form factor then lends itself to, because the definition of the form factor is it's smaller. And of course, for those of you who have young eyes, perhaps you can cram as much into your phone as you can onto your laptop screen. But for most of us, that's not the case. So, what does it mean? What it means is that there are certain things for which it is not particularly suited. So, for example, looking over large diagrams, doing an extended period of reading, and especially composing anything, drawing anything, creating anything of substance. And so the fact that people try to do these things on their phone is maddening to me. I mean, in an emergency, yes, of course, but not under normal circumstances. And it's a terrible habit to develop, to use a substandard tool that is not intended for the process. What is the phone good for? Well, essentially, it remains a communication device. And the irony, of course, is that the primary communications that the phone is used for have nothing to do with telephony. It is primarily now text based messaging, which can take the form of SMS, iMessage, WhatsApp, Slack, LinkedIn, Facebook, and so many more. What do these all have in common? What they all have in common is they are relatively short communications tools. They're bursty communications tools, which reduces the issue of having to type on a soft keyboard on the phone, and also increases the value of the fact that it's portable, because these are primarily real-time communication systems, or close to real time, versus email, which is considered asynchronous. And so use your phone for synchronous or nearly synchronous communications. Don't use it for asynchronous communication of any length or content creation of any length. The phone itself can still be used for things like, scrolling through the internet or reading things. But I don't know about you, Julian. You may have a little experience with it now because you have those phones for developing. But it's much more satisfying to do so on a large screen. There are very few formats that are better suited for the phone. The one exception I can think of is the Webtoon, which is a very specific format developed just for the phone. It is a company called Webtoon that is owned by Naver over in South Korea. And what they've done is they've taken old manga and chopped them up and reformatted them to be vertical scrolling. So a vertical scrolling comic or graphic novel is actually a perfect use of the phone. It is primarily not text driven. It is something that already was small, right? The little panels in a comic book were already small, so they were intended to be seen at a relatively small size. And so that is the phone native uh, medium. But almost all other media are better off using a laptop or something else. By the way, this may change when we finally have something like a Vision Pro 3. I'm extrapolating out to the future, that can offer the experience of a giant screen while being portable. And except it has to be the Vision Pro 3 because the current one weighs 1.5 pounds and comes with a 1.5 pound battery pack. So that is not going to get the job done. I actually saw one in person for the first time last night. I was at an event and Robert Scoble, the very famous tech influencer, was there with his Vision Pro on, going around the room, live streaming to his 500,000 Twitter followers. So I said hi to Robert. He actually played an important role in my life. He and my partner, Jeremiah Aoyang, helped launch Ustream, which was my first big financial win as an entrepreneur. And so I'm always grateful to him. Anyways, the point is, phones are not good for consuming media. I know a lot of people, because they have nothing better to do, will watch Netflix on their phone. I'm like, wow, that seems incredibly unsatisfying, but okay, if that's what you want to do, that's what you can do. Personally, what I find is the circumstances under which you might be wanting to watch Netflix on your phone, like you're in a Uber or something like that, are probably circumstances you're better served relaxing your eyes and listening to a podcast and taking in information that way. So
Hopefully the Blitzscaling a Startup podcast.
hopefully the Blitzscaling a Startup podcast or the Blitzscaling audiobook. All of these are great choices. So I think that the key then is to have this intentionality around phone usage and say, here's what I'm going to use my phone for. I'm going to use my phone for messaging, and therefore I'm going to install my messaging apps and use the phone as a way to communicate. I am not going to use my phone for consuming media on a long-term basis. Perhaps this means you don't bother installing Netflix or other things like that on your phone to remove the temptation to actually use them for that. And you would still have things like the web browser because you might need to look up information on the fly or what have you, but you would never be tempted to then use it for that purpose ahead of a laptop or tablet or something that's much more suited to it. There's a few other things I want to mention about phone hygiene that I think are important. And again, this is just my own personal opinion. Rest assured, there are other people who feel differently. One of the key things that I do about my phone is that I do not bring my phone into the bedroom. This is something that a lot of people do. They have their phone in bed, they start scrolling in bed, they wake up, they scroll, they see messages, all those different things. I don't do that. I actually charge my phone in my kitchen, which is approximately 30 or 40 feet away from where I sleep. And I will occasionally hear the buzzing of a notification or something like that as I'm going to sleep. But I say, you know what? I'm not going to get up and see that. It's okay for me to ignore it. In fact, it's easy for me to ignore it. Whereas if it were sitting there by my side or by my head as I was trying to go to sleep, I would feel obligated to look at it and see what was there. So simply creating a little physical distance between yourself and your phone when you sleep, I think can have a huge impact on both your rest and relaxation, as well as your relationship with the phone. I think that if I were to cover one or two more things, the funny thing that I've done, which is very unusual, and I'm not sure whether this is good or not, but I'll relay it anyways. One of the funny things I've done is I've separated out my podcast listening from my phone. I deliberately have a separate device just for listening to podcasts, and then I have my phone. And the reason is to make it very easy for me to instantly slip into the podcast, to not worry about the battery power on my phone, to basically have different earbuds or headsets for different tools. And I find it works well for me. Even though it means I'm carrying an extra device, I feel like the simplification of my podcast consumption makes it worthwhile.
So tell me a little bit more about avoiding temptations and then also avoiding things that might seem like they're not temptations, but they're temptations in disguise. Like I think the clearest example of this is the LinkedIn feed, where there's kind of like this psychological thing. You're like, I'm in LinkedIn, like I'm doing work, but then you're actually just like, you go into LinkedIn, then you see the feed, and you start scrolling through like someone's posts about Donald Trump or some whatever stuff that has nothing to do with the work, but you still kind of feel that you're you're kind of lying to yourself somehow. So Yeah, like how do you do to, because here we're talking about for entrepreneurs who need to
Hmm.
really optimize their time. Like if you're spending an hour scrolling through TikTok, that's actually a problem. And then, so how do you deal with that? And then how do you deal with the added complexity that there are a lot of TikTok like experiences which are masquerading as work, such
Right.
as, there's a lot of them. LinkedIn feed might be the extreme case, but um, uh, you know, like let's say people DMing you that you don't like. Like all these people reach out to me and talk to me, and like I want to talk to them, but I don't have like I don't have the time to. Like I
Right.
shouldn't be doing that. And if it's in a form factor that's really easy, you can get sucked into just talking to people where it's just non-optimal use of your time, which you might be more like think of more logically if you were writing things by mail, let's say, or meeting people face to face.
Yes, so let's talk about that temptation. You bring up a great point, which is that the news feed is one of the most powerful pieces of user interface that's ever been created because of how phenomenally engaging and addictive it is for human beings. It is an example of what I would call a supranormal stimuli. In other words, it's something that couldn't exist in nature, where you are constantly getting a stream of dopamine hits and things that are clickbait or otherwise designed to grab your attention. And it
Oh,
has
picked
been
because they grabbed other people's attention.
correct. And it's the basis of some of the most powerful business models in the world. It's made a lot of people very rich, and they would like to stay rich, which is why those news feeds are everywhere.
Can I tell
For-
you a story about
Of
newsfeed?
course. Absolutely.
Okay, so I've done this many times. I post on LinkedIn twice a day. And most I just like write whatever I think, and I just like schedule them. So I have stuff scheduled out till end of May.
Hmm.
So I post twice, and about half of what I post is like philosophy adjacent because that's like a big area of interest for me.
Yeah.
And nobody ever sees those, right? So it's like, I get like 50, like I
LinkedIn,
never get any engagement.
yeah, LinkedIn's algorithm has determined people don't actually engage with these,
Yeah,
so don't bother showing them. You're wasting an impression that could otherwise get them engaged.
correct. So like they always show me like I have about 50 impressions, which is essentially 0 impressions. Like that's a rounding error for LinkedIn. Like you never have anything below 50. Like I posted things on like a LinkedIn page that had 0 followers and I had 50 impressions. So this like means nothing. So
Right.
so here's my point. One of the tricks I found is what I do is I repost. Well, I take a screenshot of how many views, impressions I had, essentially 0.
Hmm.
And then I write a post commenting on how few people actually read my super interesting philosophy adjacent posts. And
Yeah.
those get like 10 times more engagement and views. So like my kind of clickbaity commenting on how people don't engage with my thoughtful posts get exponentially more engagement than my actually thoughtful, interesting posts, which is like tells you so much about the newsfeed form factor.
Right. Well, it's fascinating, right? So a week ago, I did a quick post just to promote our patron saint Reid Hoffman's YouTube channel, which is relatively new and not a lot of people know about. But there's of course great content there. And I just dashed off to a quick post without thinking about it very much, and put the link in the comments, and somehow it just picked up like steam, and it got more impressions than almost any other post I've done in the past year or two. And I wasn't sure why. I wonder if it's because it invokes the sacred name of Reid Hoffman or what have you. But I was like, whoa, LinkedIn is really pushing the hell out of this. Who knows? Maybe some developer somewhere was like, we should just make sure anytime somebody mentions Reid that it gets seen more often. Or maybe it's just that the name of Reid Hoffman is so engaging that it literally is like, oh, wow, this is more likely to be engaged. So it's fascinating. And again, this is the point about news feeds and all these other tools. You are a human being with a limited number of hours in a day, and you are facing off against an army of scientists, highly paid scientists and designers who spend their entire lives trying to figure out how to get your attention. So is it any wonder that we're losing that war? It is an asymmetrical warfare. and we are clearly losing. And so that's something that you have to keep in mind. Now, how do you manage to avoid that? I got to tell you, even I run into this problem. I will go to LinkedIn all the time to do work, and I will then realize that I've gotten caught up in looking at something else. The best thing you can do, as I found it, is to just, as right before you click, remind yourself why you're going there. And in your mind, picture which link you're about to click in order to take the action, whether it's to look up the person you're going to message or go to home or what have you. If you have it in your mind, you will not be distracted. So here's an example of that. It's very common for me to meet people at an event. And the way I connect with them is I have them connect with me on LinkedIn. One of the problems is that usually people are so used to hitting connect on LinkedIn, they don't realize there's a link for personalized invite, which would allow you to say why you want to meet me and how you met me, which would be much more useful the night after the event when I'm actually going back to check it out, because then I'll remember who the people are. But most people just like quickly hit comment anyways. And then that means I have to go in to LinkedIn and accept their invitation. And it usually takes a little bit of time because it takes about, I don't know why, 15 to 20 seconds for it to propagate through the system and show up as an invitation. So I will chat with them, and then I'll open up LinkedIn. And because I'm thinking very specifically, and I have another human being there, I'm thinking very specifically about accepting the invitation, I will go to their invitation. I will not be distracted. Right? That's an example of how having that clear intentionality, the instant you open up the app, will help defend against the kind of distraction that you just described. There are other tools. I do not know how well they work, but I will mention them because I have encountered them a couple of times recently. I've met a number of folks who put their phone on grayscale. And
I do that.
Yeah. And the
I
theory
do
there
that
is
on my the iPad I use for podcasts.
Yeah.
That only has the podcast app.
So the theory is that if you are in grayscale, so many of the things that are designed to catch our attention with color. And so if you go to grayscale, everything is muted and the addictiveness is dialed down a great deal, which actually makes a lot of sense, right? Just think about how much more addictive color is than black and white. There's a reason why we'll occasionally see a black and white movie, but it's pretty rare because people are like, give me that color. Give me that beautiful, vibrant color.
Well, the other tool that I use is Newsfeed Eradicator, which is not on the phone, but is on a desktop that eradicates the news feeds. But it sounds like so it sounds like your general approach is like, hey, there are things that are useful about the internet and about phones, but there are a lot of essentially companies who profit by wasting your time, and if you don't have time to, if you have nothing to do and you're just like a security guard somewhere and you're just paid to sit around, I mean, whatever. But if you're an
Even
entrepreneur,
that security guard could be writing a novel or something, right? That's still
true.
valuable time.
Or listening to the Blitzscaling a Startup podcast.
A great way to enrich the mind.
But if you're an entrepreneur and you're pressed for time, or any of these people who always walk around talking about how busy they are, you should not have time to scroll through the LinkedIn newsfeed, and you should be like you need. There's no silver bullet. You need, it's a lot of lead bullets in the words of Ben Horowitz, I think, where you have to kind of just like constantly be fighting against it. Is that, or constantly be structuring things,
yes,
knowing
exactly.
what things are like?
That was what I was going to say. What you want to do is you want to create as many structural elements of friction to slow down the stampede towards the things that are distracting and not useful, and then remove friction from going towards the things that actually are, right? So, for example, having a separate podcasting device dramatically reduces the friction involved in going from nothing to listening to a podcast. So,
okay,
what you want to do is just be intentional.
Okay, I want to ask you about that, as I think there's an interesting thread, which is leveraging the addictiveness for the benefits of the addictiveness, right? Like you want to be addicted to the things that are good.
Yes.
And I'll give you an example that I think illustrates it well. That's from my life. So I used to own a phone. Now I don't own a phone. What I do have is an iPad, and on the iPad I have essentially just one app, which is, well, I have two apps: Google Maps and then the podcasting app. And
by podcasting app, you mean a podcast listening app or a podcast creating app?
Listening.
Okay, listening.
And I try to curate the kind of like types of podcasts I have there to be like things either that I use to fall asleep or that I actually learn a lot from. Or audiobooks that are in podcast form. But what I've been thinking of doing, and it's not so much that I think it's bad to listen to podcasts or I'm trying to remove them from my life, but I would like to consume more long form content and essentially books, right? And what I was thinking of doing is to get rid of this device I have, this iPad that only plays podcasts, and buy a Kindle. And Kindles now let you have audiobooks. And they actually, the other app that I use on my pad often is note taking. Like, and they have a new Kindle that lets you take notes. So it's kind of like, hey, could I? So it's not like removing all these things from my life, right? It's like, hey, there's an addictiveness to this, like having a device and having like easy access to these things, and they're structured to be addictive. But could I make it addictive with a purpose, right? The purpose being to listen to audiobooks or to read books. So it's not so much like defensive, but it's offensive. I don't know if you see what I'm saying. And then
I see exactly what you're saying. So I think that it's interesting. That is one way to leverage it. So what you're doing is you're leveraging the addictive nature of certain media and saying, well, let's put better media in there. That's certainly one way to approach it. And I think it's probably a good one, right? That if you reduce the friction to listening to an audiobook, so it's easier to listen to an audiobook than it is to listen to a podcast, you'll probably listen to an audiobook. And, this is one of the funny things, and this is something that people may not remember, but you are probably old enough to remember, Julian.
I'm old now. It's so sad.
Yes. Once upon a time, when we went into our cars, we didn't just listen to whatever was on our phone. Right? We actually had the previous generation to this, a CD player, and before that, a tape deck in which you would put cassette tapes. And so one of the things about, a book on tape is that it would be trivially easy when you got in the car to always listen to your book. And it always knew where you were because physically it was on the same location. You push the tape in and you hit play. And that is a great example of how you can put this to your advantage by reducing the friction to listening to the content that you want to listen to at the time that you've set aside for listening to it. However, there is another way to leverage the addictiveness that I thought you were going to mention, which I leverage as well, which is the following. So there are a lot of these streaming services that produce content, programs like Netflix and Amazon Prime Video. I tend to use Amazon Prime Video because it's already included and I'm cheap. And there's lots of great content that amazing creators have put out there. So, for example, on Amazon Prime Video, I recently watched. I'm currently watching the show Good Omens, which is based on the Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett book, and it's got a wonderful cast and set of creators. Before that, I was watching a few seasons of Upload, which is an original comedy about basically uploading people's brains after they die. There's conspiracies and there's a lot of funny stuff about that reflects our modern day world. It's a little like RoboCop, but not quite as dark. And then before that, I'd watched the action show Reacher, which is about a guy who goes around killing bad guys, which of course is always very, very appealing to Americans who love the idea that, all the world needs is a charismatic, handsome, large white man to kill people and life will be good. All of these are incredibly designed, expensive entertainments. I should also mention The Rings of Power by Amazon Prime, Star Trek Lower Decks and Discovery by Paramount Plus, and Ted Lasso by Apple TV Plus, and so on and so forth. I restrict myself to watching this content when I'm on the exercise bicycle or treadmill. And so something that people might otherwise find difficult to do, going to the exercise bicycle, going to the treadmill, then becomes the only way I permit myself to consume this content. And that increases the chances that I will then go and do the exercise, for the very simple reason that now I've tied the exercise to something else that's even more addictive.
Yeah, that's a really smart one. And I guess it's like the overall, like if I was going to summarize your thinking on this, it's, hey, look, technology and phones and the internet, that's just part of your life. You can live your life without it. But you don't want to, right? Like,
No.
it's really useful. But there are a lot of upsides, and there are also a lot of downsides, and you need to work actively to reduce the downsides, because the downsides can take over your entire life. And the way to reduce the downsides is structurally. So you want to create a context where you're going to, so you want to kind of like take a step back, observe your behavior, say, hey, I don't like that I'm always on my TikTok app. Let me delete it. And you might say, actually, I've realized even if I delete it, I end up just downloading it again. I always do that. Okay, well, what can I do? Maybe there's another solution. And you, like, the solution isn't to like use up your executive function, as you say, to fight against your desires, but rather to set up a context, structurally adjust your life and your devices so that you end up doing, naturally wanting to do the behaviors that are good for you. And that can either be removing negative behaviors or, rewarding positive behaviors, like, going to the gym.
Correct. And again, it all comes down to realizing that you are not fully in control yourself, right? You are making decisions, but then there are other elements of your subconscious or automated systems that you don't fully control. And you could spend your time fighting against them, but you're better off either erecting structural barriers, which will do the fighting for you without you expending any executive function, or actually leaning into them and leveraging those instincts to go on your behalf. So I have a cool thing I'm going to show you. Hold on. This is a little clock that I bought from Amazon. And if you notice, it's got a series of times. So it's a timer that could do 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15, 20, or 30. I primarily have it for the 20 minutes, but I have it for other reasons. Now, this is an interesting little thing. Because it's physical, it's quick. Right? If I want to set the timer for 20 minutes, I just set the timer for 20 minutes and it goes. And then when I want to stop, I just hit stop. Think about all the steps I would have to go through to set this timer on my phone. To go through, click it. I used to do this, I had Pomodoro apps on my phone.
Yeah.
But I realized that most of the time I needed it at my desk. And this is actually so much faster. And the fact that it's physical actually increases its impact. The second thing is, what I find is when I think about work that I have to do, it can be a little daunting because I have a lot of work. You probably have a lot of work too. You may be superhuman, Julian, and always be feeling like you want to work. But, I am old and worn out, and therefore sometimes I don't always feel like working. However, what I can do is I can chain it together. I can say, well, I can physically do that. And then once I do that, I'm like, okay, now I need to work. And now it's not me forcing myself to work. It's the clock doing the work for me. And then I might glance over at a sheet of paper where I have down what are the things I need to do. I'm like, okay, start the first one. I mean, the clock is going, so therefore it's time for me to work. And so that fraction of a second that it took to do that can then power 20 minutes worth of work. Whereas if I were trying to come up with the willpower to start on my own, it would have been much more difficult. I compare it to the experience of going into a swimming pool. Julian, I'm sure you've swum in a swimming pool many times, correct?
I used to have one at my house when when I was growing up. My parents did.
Now, the big
So
problem
yes.
with swimming pools, unless you are incredibly wasteful of heat or live in a tropical climate, is that they tend to be colder than you would like.
Yeah,
And
my
when
parents
you
had a heated swimming pool. In Canada, there's only like 1 month a year where you can like essentially either like they had a kind of like they lived on the waterfront. They had like a fancy swimming pool like
yeah,
that's like dug in. It was like huge, and they'd heat it because like in Canada you only have like 1 month of
yeah.
appropriate weather for the swimming pool unless you heat it.
So picture, if you will, a swimming pool which is not necessarily heated, but isn't Canadian ice cold. It is a temperature that's suitable for swimming, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius, but not comfortably warm. As you get into that swimming pool, you start stepping down, you feel the cold water going up your legs. And then the dread sets in. Oh my God, you know, there's the if I keep walking, it's going to reach those sensitive genitalia and it's going to be really unpleasant, or at least people
You
think.
need someone just push you in.
So I don't push in. What I do is I step down till I'm in with my knees, so I've been able to test the water, and I'm like, okay, now I'm just going to jump. Now I'm just going to jump forward and immerse myself, and I can force myself to jump forward and immerse myself. I couldn't do it if I were still slowly walking because each time I have to continue using my willpower to keep going. But instead, it's like impulsively, let me just do something that takes a fraction of a second, and then I'm off and running.
Hey, so okay, this Pomodoro thing, I know it's a popular framework. It's
Yeah.
not something that works for me at all. Um
Probably because you can concentrate for longer periods of time, so it actually interrupts your concentration.
I think yeah, like I found just the way that I work, like I'm like the best I heard someone else kind of um frame it this way, which is like working like a big cat, so like a tiger or stuff like that, where like I'll sometimes be like super lazy and then I'll be like super productive for a really long time. That's just my personal style. Like if
Yeah.
I'm totally disinterested, it's very hard for like I almost can't force myself to do anything. And then if I'm interested and I'm pretty good like making myself interested, I can do like huge amounts of work. And so the trick for me is kind of like trick myself into being interested. So like
Mm.
I remember when I was younger, I had like really boring jobs, especially when I was doing like more data science work, like it's a lot like labeling stuff, massive pain. But what I do is I would kind of like optimize how to label. So
Yes,
I
you were
have to like
trying to say,
manually,
can I beat my old record? Can I go faster
exactly.
than before? Can I get
Yeah.
closer and closer to a theoretical limit? Absolutely.
Exactly. And so I could get myself to just like be super productive at manually labeling data, let's say, um, by just tricking myself into like finding the optimal structure to do it. That's the type of stuff that works for me. The Pomodoro stuff doesn't work for me. And my wife, Kelly, she's very different from me. Like, so for example, she has a phone. She's relatively capable of not looking at it.
Hmm.
For me, I find it much more addictive than she does. So I think where I'm getting at is different things work for different people. And I
Correct.
assume what you need to do as an individual is find what works for you. And so that I struggled with in the past, I think my work style or my style of doing things is just different from like I'm really not type A, right? And I think most people that I've ever worked with and most people who achieve a lot generally like very type A kind of like overperformers who got like good grades in school. And that's just not my profile at all. It might be typical for entrepreneurs actually, but most of the people I've worked with are, and most of the people who give you advice and who are doing these tricks have a different psychological profile to me. But everyone has a unique psychological profile. So what I guess, how would you think of finding what works for you with an understanding that what works for some people doesn't necessarily work, for you?
This is where embracing the traditional or perhaps even an informal version of the scientific method holds true, which is to conduct experiments and observe and see what works for you. The example I always use, just because I think it's a little more tangible, is I give the example of iodine. I don't know if you've ever had a cut and put iodine on a cut. It hurts.
It's like an old school thing, but yeah, I have.
It's an old school thing. It's like a terrible idea because, it's like staining and it's painful and all that. But over time, having tried many different treatments for minor wounds and abrasions, minor cuts, I've found, and unfortunately, I pick up a lot of them because, I will stub my shins on something or something like that. I find that I respond the best to iodine. My wife does not respond well to iodine. So I could tell her, hey, it works for me. Guess what? It doesn't work for her. She has to use something else. And whatever she uses wouldn't work as well for me. And that's fine because just like our bodies are different, our minds are different, our psychologies are different. And you should find the iodine that works for you, whatever it may be.
Yeah. Another example that is, like here I'm in Asia, they have the Tylenol brand. It's
Mhm.
still Tylenol, but it's a different product than, like, it's a different substance than
Oh,
the
it's
United
it's
States.
not acetyl. So
No,
in Tylenol is
acetaminophen or
no,
whatever.
it's Tylenol is acetyl salicylic acid,
Okay.
and
Oh,
that's
whatever.
that's that's aspirin, and then acetaminophen is
Yeah.
Tylenol,
Okay.
and then
Right.
ibuprofen, of course, is Advil or Motrin.
Right. Right. Well, they have something. Anyways, the Tylenol brand
Hmm,
here is like a different
interesting.
product than in the United States because, and in Canada, because Asians react better to.
Bring some of that stuff back with you. I'd like to see what this is, especially if it's better for my physiology somehow.
No, I don't know, but yeah, okay, that's been super interesting, Chris. And like, before we wrap up, what would you say is, if folks are going to take one thing away from this conversation, what do you think that should be?
Well, I think the thing you should take away is the fact that you should be thoughtful about your phone usage. Not thoughtful in terms of always trying to prevent yourself from using the phone or using some sort of willpower battle, but rather thoughtful about what your phone is good for and what isn't it good for, and set up the structure of your life so that it maximizes the friction to prevent you from doing things that it's not good for and minimizes the friction to do the things that it is good for. I wouldn't try to go cold turkey. I wouldn't want to go cold turkey. But little things like installing or uninstalling the right applications, getting multiple devices if necessary to reduce friction, and making sure that you keep the charging plug somewhere other than your bedroom, these things can have a big impact. Again, it will vary from person to person, just as you discovered. The Pomodoro method might work for me, it might not work for Julian, but you should experiment and find out for yourself. Of course, trying the things that have worked for most people is a great place to start. But then, if you want to try something else, by all means, because the amount of time it takes to try making a structural change where your plug is, it might take you 1 minute to move your charging plug from your bedroom to somewhere else. But that 1 minute invested might affect tens of hours or even more of your time over the coming year. So it's well worth it to make that investment.
Chris, thank you. And mostly everyone who's watching or listening, thank you for spending this time with us.
It's always appreciated, and I'm glad that we are finding ways to make your lives even more productive and hopefully happier.